Hey everybody, this is Fountain Bookstore on Crowdcast. My name is Kelly Justice and I am your host this evening. I am so excited to uh, be I'm excited to be a member of the audience tonight. You know what? That's what I'm excited about. I've been a bookseller for 31 years, and one of the blessings of my job, one of the great things about this job is I get to do something that I love every day with things that I love. These, of course, I've got everybody's books in the world, but our speakers, the books that I love and people that I love. I see friends in the audience, new friends in the audience as well, and from all over the world. And what a wonderful. There's been a lot of super serious garbage dumpster fire stuff going on for months and months and months now. And but some good things have come out of this ability to gather from all over the world to share stories and be together maybe with people who wouldn't have had a chance to be with. So I'm gonna get our authors on screen. There's going to be a program for a while, and then there's going to be a Q&A. If you're unfamiliar with Crowdcast, there is a ask a question button. It might be over there, depending on what kind of device you're using. And when we get to Q&A, you can put your questions in there, or you can put them in the chat, and I will move them on over into the ask a question thing, and you can just wait, and they'll get answered. And we'll try to get to everybody. I know we're all excited. This event was suggested by Cory Doctorow, who's been to Fountain Bookstore in person, which it's not purple. This is my house, and he's been there in person as our guest. Our other two authors tonight, Sarah Gailey and Chuck Wendig, who I've only met on Twitter, both of them. May or may not have been able to ever get to Fountain Bookstore, but they're here with us tonight and here for you. So I hope you're ready for a wonderful night of conversation, and hope everybody's had a chance to get in. So here we go. I am going to bring our guests on tonight. Hey, Sarah.
Hi there.
Cory and Chuck.
Very good.
Bye for a while.
That's the way they became the Brady Bunch. All right. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I had the extreme pleasure to do a tour event stop at Fountain. And if any of you are Fountain locals here for the Fountain as much as for me, count yourself very lucky to have such a wonderful store in your hometown. This is a privilege that many of us do not get, and cherish the bookstores in your neighborhood. So tonight we're here to talk about my latest book, Attack Surface. And I have two stupendous guests for our cross-genre science fiction event. The first is Sarah Gailey, an internationally published best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction. And the second is Chuck Wendig, the New York Times best-selling author of Wanderers, alongside of other books, comics, games, films, and more. And I'm Cory Doctorow. The plan is that I'm going to read very briefly. There's like a little 5-minute reading from Attack Surface. And then I have some questions for my co-panelists. And ideally, that'll just kick us off. But if not, I have some backup questions if we run out of things to talk about. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from Attack Surface now. Attack Surface, as you probably know, is the third Little Brother book. It's a standalone book for adults. It's a book about technologists who have spent their careers, instead of giving people freedom with technology, taking it away, having a moral reckoning with what it means to have devoted your life to that, and how that rebounds. And the point of view character is a woman named Masha. You will know her from the first two books as a kind of antagonist who has an on-again, off-again, maybe crush, maybe romance with Marcus, the hero of the first book. And as the book opens, she is on location in a country she euphemistically calls Slovakia, a former Soviet republic where she is just a straight up cyber mercenary, helping fat-fingered Borises take away freedom from pro-democracy movements, figure out who to jail and torture. And her hobby is teaching those same pro-democracy activists how to avoid the surveillance gear that she's installing. And this is how she sleeps at night. And she has just come from a very intense moment doing this, and an alarm has gone off on her phone to remind her that there's a virtual wedding that she needs to attend in Boston. They'd made everyone they love fly to Boston for the wedding because of the girls' grad school schedule, and they'd filled the hall with robots they'd borrowed from the MIT Media Lab to give it some nerd cred. Of course, she didn't wear white. Her dress was ribbed with EL wire that pulsed in time with the music, and Marcus's suit, Beatles black with a narrow tie and drainpipe pants that made his legs look even scrawnier than usual, was also wired up, but it only pulsed when they touched, moving bands of light across its surface from the point of contact. Okay, that was pretty cool. The officiant was a prominent Cambridge hacker, one of the ones they'd hauled in when they were after Chelsea Manning. She'd been a kid then, but now she looked older, her wife holding their kids on her lap off to the side. She wore a colander on her head because she was ordained in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which was, frankly, too much. Marcus and his girlie exchanged vows. Marcus promised to make her coffee, rub her feet, review her code, say sorry and mean it, and she promised to back down when she was wrong, forgive him when he apologized, and love him, quote, until the wheels came off. Double, ugh. They kissed and received their applause. I gave it 3 minutes, making sure that the ceremony was well and truly done and the reception about to start. I'm not a monster. Here's the thing about Cambridge. They have drone delivery there. For a little extra, you can time the delivery to the minute. I checked the time in the corner of the screen. There is a big window right behind the officiant with a view of the Charles River and the snow and the tracks of students' boots. I checked the time again. The drone came right up to the window and rapped on it politely. It had 4 big rotors and a sensor package that fed me all kinds of telemetry on the activity in the room, from Bluetooth device IDs to LiDAR outlines of all the humans in the space. The wedding live stream showed it tapping on the window from the bride and groom's POV. The stream ran off about a dozen cameras and was smart enough to switch between them based on which was capturing the most action. The stream from the drone showed me the opposite view, Marcus and his girl and all their nice nerdly friends and family, gaping at the fisheye camera. Marcus broke the tableau by opening the window, and the drone daintily coasted into the room and deployed its box into his hand. He pulled the ripstop on the plasticky wrapping and revealed the gift wrap box within. She took the card out of the envelope and read it. I admit, it gave me a shiver to hear her speak my name. When Marcus heard it, his face did a funny. That gave me a shiver too, a different kind. He and I have a complicated history. I rubbed my fingers, the ones he'd broken, when I was only 16. He did it in order to steal my phone because I had video of that exonerated him of being a terrorist. It's complicated. Those fingers hurt whenever I thought of him. He looked at the drone sensor package. Thank you, Masha, he said, wherever you are. The usual for this was to be a recording that you could watch later, but if you are a creepy stalker chick, you could watch it in real time. I emojied the drone and it bobbled a curtsy and gave me 5 seconds to commit another $50 to hold on to it for 5 more minutes, because it had other packages to deliver. I released it and its feed died. On the live stream, I watched them unwrap my gift. I'd almost sent them a bag of Kopi Luwak, which is a kind of coffee bean that's fed raw to a civet cat, then harvested from its poop and roasted. But then I read an animal welfare article about the treatment of civet cats. So I'd given them a Raspberry Altair 8080. That is a 1974 personal computer that you control with a row of faceplate switches, and read using peanut bulb blinking lights, which had been painstakingly restored with a Raspberry Pi open source CPU inside it, giving it approximately 8 bazillion times its original computing power. Most of the interior was left empty by the refit, and the craftswoman who'd sold it to me had filled the empty space with a bunch of carved wooden automata that cranked a set of irregular gears around in whirling circles while the computer was operating, which you could see if you swapped in the optional transparent case. Marcus knew exactly what it was, because I'd found it through his Twitter feed, and how much it cost, because he'd moaned about never being able to afford it, not in a million years, and he had a look of profoundly satisfying shock on his face. He told his girlie all about it in spittle-flecked hyperactive mode he slipped into when he was really, really excited. The expression that crossed her face was even more exciting, a mix of jealousy and appreciation that I reveled in like the petty, terrible person I am. I felt like the fairy who curses Sleeping Beauty out of spite when she thinks she hasn't been invited to her christening, except that this was a wedding and not a christening. Oh, and they'd invited me, of course. So I thought that was a good little cross-genre read because it's the most romantic of the parts of the book. It's a book for adults, which means that it doesn't have any sex in it. That's what teenagers get to have. It's a book for adults because it's got a bunch of moral reckoning in it, which is what adults get to have if they're very lucky. So, Sarah, given that this is about cross-genre science fiction, I immediately went to your last novel, which was just a wonderful short book that is a crossover Western called Upright Women Wanted. That's a post-apocalyptic Western queer radical library novella, which is just all the things. And one of the things that struck me about it was the thing that made it Western was that everyone in it who mattered was working class. And that's not a thing we see much of in science fiction. There's a kind of critical understanding now that since science fiction grew out of the post-war boom and the demand for skilled technical trades, that everyone who was into it, all the engineers, had suddenly been vaulted into a really protected labor category, much like the techies of today, where they could tell their boss to take the job and shove it, even if they weren't in a union, because there was another job for them across the street. And so there's no trade unions, there's no class war, there's none of that stuff in most of our early science fiction. And yet Westerns, of course, are full of it because of cowboy socialism. And it struck me that in that way, you had found a crossover. So what I wondered is, like, when does this stop being SF? And what are the limits of SF? How crossovery can you get?
Ooh,
this is be SF?
This is a really tasty question. First of all, as soon as you said cowboy socialism, like, my little shriveled heart grew a size. I would say that, the boundaries of SF don't exist. I know that there are a lot of people who mine a lot of internet points from the notion of some hard boundary between literary fiction and speculative fiction, and there being this great rivalry between the two. But I would argue that a lot of literary fiction is more speculative than the stuff that I write, and a lot of speculative fiction is not actually that speculative. This is part of what drives me nuts about something I'm sure you're familiar with, when someone says, oh, the speculative fiction book is coming true, it was prescient, and it's like, yeah, it's based on humans and human behavior, and a lot of us are writing about human society and the way it functions now and historically. So, like, the speculation is kind of just math that we're doing, and we're saying, hey, here's a possible outcome to the equation that we've been building together as a society for so long. Most of the things in Upright Women Wanted are based on real life things, right? There's a lot of queer cowboys because there were a lot of queer cowboys. A lot of the control of media and communication in the near future US fascist government is like, it's not new. I didn't invent it. I often tell people when they're like, where do you get your ideas? I'm like, I don't have that big an imagination. It's not things that I'm creating from nowhere. And then, when you look at a lot of literary fiction, one that comes to mind is one that I recently had a conversation with someone about. They were saying, oh, I want to write for this speculative fiction series of literary analysis essays about the book Gone with the Wind, because they had missed the part of the prompt that said speculative fiction. But I was like, well, if I'm having people write stuff about fantasy for this series, what's a better one? What's more inventive than the world of Gone with the Wind? That book creates more bonkers, out of nowhere ideas than I could ever come up with myself. So I guess I'm going to give kind of like a non-answer and say that I don't think the boundary between speculative fiction and other genres really exists. And the way that I write, you mentioned that I'm writing in Upright Women Wanted about working class people. I'm not writing about like the kings and queens and big movers and shakers. I just don't find them that interesting. I see people in fiction who are like the big man with the tentacle suit who runs everything in the whole world, and I'm like, okay, so is the interesting thing the tentacles or the impact they have? And for me personally, the more interesting thing is the impact and how people survive and work through that impact, because that's closer to my experience. I've never had that big tentacle suit. I'm not saying I wouldn't take it, though. If someone's offering, if anyone watching this is like, hey, Sarah Gailey, do you want a big tentacle suit to ride around town? The answer is yes. There's an email form on my website. Get in touch.
As the old riddle goes, what's a hentai? It strikes me as you give that answer that one of the things that I've always found interesting is that all novels have at least one science fictional conceit, which is that you can know what another person is thinking. this being a thing that no human being in the history of our species has ever done, is known the thoughts of another, and yet it's a commonplace in all of our genre. So Chuck, you've written across a very wide range of genre and media. You in fact could have been on last night's panel about or the night before about cross medium science fiction as much as cross genre science fiction. But one of the areas that you seem to straddle quite adroitly, and that's very relevant to this book, is the techno thriller science fiction crossover there. And I know Bruce Sterling, who's joining in a future one of these on Monday, he says that a techno thriller is just a science fiction novel with the president in it. But I think that you know, the definition might have to be expanded a little. And when I think about books of yours like Zeros, especially, that there's such an unmissable element of them that makes them not mainstream science fiction, but rather a techno thriller. And I wondered if you could kind of dig into what makes a story science fiction for you, what makes it a techno thriller, why you go for one and the other, how you choose, and so on.
Yeah, boy, like with Sarah, I have no good answer for this. Like, I just feel like I have a non-answer coming. So I don't really set out to write a techno thriller, and I don't necessarily even set out to write a science fiction novel. With Wanderers and with Zeros and with Invasive and these books that I'm writing, first of all, I'm essentially writing a horror novel. Not because I'm specifically trying to hit these tropes of what you consider horror, but because I have a head full of anxieties about the world in which we live, and sometimes that's bound up with the future and the near future and all of the technology that binds us together and also separates us. And so I Wanderers especially is a book that I often say is like a summoner, a sorcerer bringing demons into the summoning circle, and that's where he can fight them. It's like I have an anxiety Voltron for these books, and I sort of smash a bunch of anxieties together, and I let the book kind of handle that for me. And it's a place where I can contextualize those problems and those fears and those worries about what's to come and what we're dealing with now. And so I don't worry about like the tropey part of what makes a good techno thriller. Wanderers kind of has the president in it, but they're always sub characters. Like I aim to sort of have more of those working class characters, the people who are more blue collar farmers and journalists, and people who can kind of be on the ground, boots on the ground, instead of out of that 30,000 foot kind of view of those bigger characters. But for me, it's not setting out to write any one particular genre. It's kind of setting out to tell those anxieties and figure out how I can, in fact, actually a book like Invasive, which is about genetically modified killer ants. The ants are for me kind of a metaphor about anxiety itself. And it's a book very much about simply anxiety and being covered by, all of the things you're afraid of at any given moment in time.
Yeah, that's a great answer. One of the things that strikes me about science fiction is that it's become a kind of historical literature, right? Its tropes are really fixed in the mid-century. It is like very recognizably, like all that talk about jetpacks and so on. For some reason, my camera's not focusing well, but I wore my mid-century I Have Seen the Future 1964 World's Fair badge. Before I get too excited, it's a repro for that. And it seems like, there was this old joke that the golden age of science fiction is 12, and maybe that the golden age of science fiction is 1964, that it is reflective of that moment. And I wonder, do you feel like when you sit down to commit SF, that you are in some way just like someone who's mixing their own gesso and trying to reproduce the style of Michelangelo, that you are conjuring into the room a mindset from now 60 years ago, 70 years ago?
I mean, I think it's impossible not to be in conversation with tropes and also with stereotypes. I think that the nature of those things is that they kind of get into the water and they get into everything and they sink into your brain. I'm almost never consciously trying to be in conversation with things that I haven't read, and I haven't read a lot of the older canon. I just haven't set aside time for it, and then all of a sudden there was this new current golden bloom of SFF for me to immerse myself in. But that doesn't mean that if I'm in conversation with the things being written today and they're in conversation with things being written 60 years ago, by nature, we're all in conversation with each other. I think it's kind of impossible to avoid without a lot of really conscious thought and effort.
How about you, Chuck?
Yeah, I always, it's funny because we're, Sarah was talking about how people always say that science fiction is this prescient thing, this thing that you're like, well, you foretold the future. And it's like, no, I just did a lot of sort of emotional, sociopolitical calculus, and here we are. I just put stuff together, and she put together. That's kind of what we're all doing. And so the conversation is often perceived to be with us with the future. But I do really feel like it's either a conversation with the past or with the present, and sometimes both. I don't really strive to have the conversation with the past, but I definitely do try to be talking about what's happening now. Again, with that sort of anxiety issue, I really like to focus on the things that I'm seeing and feeling outside my window, as opposed to sort of grappling with a canon that came before. I mean, certainly I've read some of it, but I was fed on a wide variety of strange books from across all the genres, and sometimes my conversation is just as much with figuring out the connective tissue between those genres as it is with SF in general.
Huh. Yeah, this business of predicting the future, I always find the most fraught when I talk about science fiction with people who aren't engaged, or even sometimes people who are, because of course people who claim to know the future are charlatans, right? I mean, like historically, right? We like they're palmists, they're tea leaf readers, right? They're fakes. They're faking themselves too, but they're fakes. And I always find something very fatalistic about the idea of a knowable future, because if the future is knowable, then what we do doesn't matter, right? Then, we've gotten on the subway and it's going to the next station, and we can run up and down the car and shout, no, turn left, but nothing's going to happen. And I like the idea of a contestable future. We have a colleague, the wonderful Ada Palmer, who, as part of her Renaissance history courses at the University of Chicago, where she's tenured, every year reenacts the election of the Medici's Pope in a 4-week-long LARP with her undergrads, where they all are given the real identities of actual historic personages. And they spend weeks like texting each other and building alliances and stabbing each other in the back. And in the last day, in the investiture, which they do in costume, because she has a Google alert for theater companies selling costumes, the final four, 2 of them are always the same people, because the great forces of history are in fact bearing down on that moment. But 2 of them are never the same and have never been the same. And that tells you that within that maybe the great forces of history define the parameters of our human action, but they're not dispositive of it, right? There's always parameters, and within the parameters we have space to move. And of course, those great forces of history are just the echoes of things that people did of their own volition in a previous iteration, a century before, 50 years before, and whatever. So that was just in response. But I wanted to ask a question about historicity in science fiction, because the 2 of the boldest science fiction trilogies that I've read in this century, I guess, are William Gibson's pattern recognition books and Neal Stephenson's System of the World. So Stephenson, with System of the World, decided to write about the invention of calculus and the Enlightenment in, I guess, the 16th or 17th century as though it were a science fiction novel. And so he just tells the straight up historic narrative that spans about 3,000 pages in science fiction style. And then Bill Gibson went him one better and wrote about the stuff that happened last year, like it was happening in the future. And like where the people were encountering it and it was the moment that he was writing about. It was the transformation of American society after 9/11 into a paranoid, surveillance-oriented, semi-militarized state. And that to me felt like not even a subversion of the science fiction toolkit, but like a use of the science fiction toolkit, right? To force that re-examination. And I wondered if you had stories that you felt like either use science fiction to do something to another genre, or another genre to do something to science fiction, like your Western, Sarah, for example.
Books of ours, or books in general that sort of
any kind of work. I mean, it doesn't have to be books. It can be movies. Steampunk is obviously like a big example of some of this stuff happening,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that part of the like the conversation between history and the future and the speculative is viewing through my American and an American education lens the fact that any actual historical perspective feels speculative, right? Our American educational system teaches us history in a way that's like, here's this narrative that excludes a lot of facts and makes up a lot of facts. And so if you use history to tell a story, people are like, whoa, that could never happen. That's bananas. And so, I mean, one of, I think, the most broadly accessible versions of this is Handmaid's Tale, that, brings history into the speculative and says, oh, look at this possible future. Isn't that bonkers? It's based on things that have happened in the reality that you inhabit all over the world. Which doesn't answer your question about books that bring other genres in, but I just find it super fascinating. And I'm going to connect it via a smooth segue to actually answer your question. When you talk about my Westerns, that's what I'm doing with them, is bringing in, the pulp Western genre, which is super fun and gonzo, and saying, okay, let's bring speculative fiction elements into this. Let's bring historicity into this. With Upright Women Wanted, let's bring like a projected future of American military fascism into it. I, as I said before, I think that the line between those genres is super perforated, and it makes it really easy to just drag them all together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you want your heart broken, go find Stephen Gould's book Seventh Sigma, which was the first book of a series that got canceled. That's a science fiction Western set in New Mexico that is like just unbelievably brilliant. He's the guy who wrote Jumper, and it's just such a superb Western novel. It's based on these invasive insects that eat metal that are probably nanotech. And so big parts of New Mexico become an exclusion zone where nothing metal can be used. And so like Verizon has hot air balloons that they use for heliograph networks that bridge into the network on the other side of the exclusion zone. And it's full of people with crossbows doing Westerns in New Mexico. It's so good. So
that
so
sounds
good.
Amazing.
Yeah. Chuck, how about you? Are there crossovers that you feel push the boundaries of science fiction, or use science fiction to push the boundaries of other stuff?
In terms of something like television, when you're talking about how Stevenson is, in to some degree, a lot of writers are able to tell these stories set in the past, but in a way that sort of uses the jumping board of science fiction. *Halt and Catch Fire* is a great show. I mean, just basically about that sort of early days of computing, but it's told like, I feel like a science fiction, like a techno thriller, like a science fiction story. *The Good Place* is, while it's fantastic and fantastical, it still seems to base itself in its own rules of like, as if there's a science involved. There's this digital simulacrum and different realms of existence and portals between them, but they're not. It's sort of one of those things where, if you kind of close one eye, it's fantasy, and close the other, it's science fiction. In terms of historical stuff, Wanderers is very much about an election and a pandemic. I didn't, obviously, again, I didn't mean to write that, but I was really trying to talk about, the things I saw going on, and that used sort of those models of like what has come the last 10 years to get to that story.
Yeah, that business of like not predicting but reflecting is I find really interesting. I think that what helps science fiction writers seem prescient is how short our memories are. And so, Little Brother, like I wrote Little Brother and I made 3 bets, right? One was that computer science would remain pretty static, right? That we wouldn't invent computers that had new capabilities, theoretical capabilities or limitations. Computer engineering would continue to be very dynamic. So we'd find new ways to use our theoretically static computers, and they would become more important to our lives. And that policymakers would continue to fail to grapple with either of those facts, right? And that, so like I wrote that book 14 years ago, it came out 12 years ago. And apart from the lack of social media, which was deliberate because I was still hoping that Facebook would die in a fire in 2006,
it's right on.
It's pretty contemporary, not because of the fine details, but the shape of our policy struggles are nearly identical to what they were back then. And we just forget that in 2006, we were fighting over encryption and fighting over net neutrality and fighting over monopoly and fighting over surveillance. And, here we are and having learned nothing. All of those fights just mean more now. One of the things about science fiction is that it is both a genre and a culture or a subculture, and it's become a hotly contested nexus of culture war garbage. And I wondered, from this perspective of 2020, looking back, seeing what the field has become, what it is at its best and what it is at its worst, what you hope will remain and what you think would be great to see kind of upregulated as the culture of science fiction moves on.
Did we lose Sarah? I don't see Sarah.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Can you see me?
Yeah, sorry. No, I just.
Am I still a person?
You're not a person.
So far. Well, apart from the tentacles.
Wait, you can see those? Oh no. Oh, I'm in trouble. I'm supposed to keep those out of sight. I mean, I'm definitely part of this kind of new school SFF, right? I came into SFF not connected to the fan culture, but instead really from a writing and literary perspective. And so it was sort of a blast of cold water to the face, being like, wow, a whole new community just for me. And then a lot of parts of that community were like, wait, I'm sorry, you're queer, disabled, like assigned female at birth, you seem like you have a lot of opinions that oppose fascism, and that is not welcome here. Those are the parts that I would love to see upregulated, which is such a great way to put that. Oh, I'm keeping that. I'm pretending I birthed it. It's mine. And I would love to see more of the continuation of, first of all, just inclusion of more voices that have been historically underrepresented in the genre, more uplifting of those voices and perspective. And also, man, I really love seeing SFF lean into being explicitly political. There's no such thing as apolitical literature or writing, but I feel like a lot of the SFF writers I know who in the past have been like, gosh, I don't know if I should bring politics into this, which are not necessarily present in this conversation right now, are finding some courage and saying, you know what? Why bother being subtle? Nothing else is.
It's funny because it's the most ahistoric thing is the idea that science fiction is apolitical. Literally, the first Worldcon nearly dissolved in a fight because the Futurians were excluded from the banquet for being too lefty. And so, the idea that who brought politics into this science fiction? It's like, who brought smoke into this Southern cuisine or something? Like, honestly, it's been there since day one. How about you, Chuck?
I mean, obviously, all of what Sarah said, bigger tent, more voices, and a signal boosting of those voices. I like it when the genre gets squirrely. I don't like it when it's just kind of that one thing that sort of like, I don't think science fiction is always at its best when it grapples with that idea of a golden age that's in the 60s is not the ideal golden age. I think we're in a new golden age now, and I would like to reckon with that for a little while. I also like when it gets weird. Just like, I don't necessarily, always want it sort of neatly lined up. I like it when it gets pretty strange. I like it when it messes with its writing styles. Stevenson was really good at, especially at the outset, sort of messing with how stories are told, and I wasn't expecting that. I'd like to see more funny science fiction. I don't think there's enough of that, and I don't think people buy enough of it. I would want more people to just buy weird, funny, emotional, heartfelt science fiction. That's what I would want.
Yeah, R.I.P. Terry Pratchett, huh?
Yeah.
Always. I really like what you were saying, Chuck, about not loving the idea of the golden age having been in the 60s. And I often say the same thing that you did just now about us being in a golden age now. But I just had this thought, there's this thing that always drives me bonkers, which is when adults tell teenagers, like, this is the best years of your life.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, why would you say that's such a horrible thing to say to someone who has so much life in front of them?
My dad told me that, and then later when I was in my 20s, he's like, oh yeah, I was just lying to you about that. They were horrible. Those years were the worst. And I was like, oh, thanks. God, I could have used that.
It looks like, from where I'm sitting, it looks like Cory is vanished. So this is our book event now. I really wish that we would say, hey, you're back.
I'm trying to get the questions, and I clicked the open a new tab, and everything went bad.
Oh, no. I'm glad you survived that harrowing experience. I was just about to say that I really want us in SFF to stop asking what the golden age was and start being like, oh, there's so much golden age to come. This can be our worst golden age right now, and then we can just have a better one, and a better one, and a better one. So I hope that 20 years from now we look back and we're like, ugh, that was the tin age.
We're all just building layers of sediment at this point. Yeah, they're all building on top of us, and that's fine.
So I had the opposite experience to you in terms of my history with fandom, Sarah, and that I kind of came into it really early in my life, and it was because of something that I really like about fandom, which is mentorships. So when I was 6 years old, I started watching Doctor Who with my dad while my mom was at doing her master's at night. And the woman who would introduce Doctor Who every Tuesday or whatever it was on our local public broadcaster was Judith Merrill, who my dad knew from political circles because they were both Marxists. And Judy, if you don't know, was one of those Futurians who was excluded from the First World Con. She had been married to Frederick Pohl. She went into voluntary exile in Canada after the 1968 police riots in Chicago. And she founded what is now the largest public science fiction reference collection in the world, the Merrill Collection in Toronto, which archives my papers and is an amazing library. And if you have papers and you're looking for a long-term place to store them, they'll take your papers. They'll even, I think we can give you a tax receipt. I'm on the board now. So they're a really wonderful organization. And when I was 9 years old, I went on a school trip to the library, which was then called the Spaced Out Library. She wouldn't let them name it after her until she retired. And she was the writer in residence. And she told us, group of 9-year-olds, if you have a manuscript, bring it down and I'll help you out with it. And that is how I became a science fiction writer. This towering editor, critic, writer, historic figure in the field really tucked me under her wing. And not just me, but a whole generation of writers. What she would do is she would mentor you along and then find other writers who were about the same place in their lives as you, and then put you in a workshop together. So I ended up in a workshop with Peter Watts and Carl Schrader and Madeline Ashby and a bunch of other writers. And so, that part of science fiction is so good, and you see elements of it echoed down through some of the collaborative writers, not all of whose writing was to my taste. Larry Niven and Mercedes Lackey and a bunch of other writers who I quite like Misty, for the record, but I'm not a giant Larry Niven fan. But what he did, where he would go out and find writers and they'd collaborate on books together, and some of our great writers in the field, like Steve Barnes, started through those collaborations. And that to me feels like something that is distinctive to our literature. There are lots of literatures where there's just hustlers who will try and get you to attend an MFA, but there aren't many where there is this idea that you pay your debts forward and you take writers under your wing.
Oh, I really love that. I think that's so beautiful. I think the only other writing circles I've seen this in is in journalism.
Yeah,
I've
that's
had
true.
More journalists than I can count scoop me up and say, are you a journalist? Do you want to be a journalist? Can I tell you things about journalism and give you advice and help you? And I'm like, I don't think that I'm cut out for this, but thank you very much. And then they always set me back down on my little baby legs and say like, okay, come back to me when you realize that everything you're doing can bring you to journalism and that journalism is important and good. And I mean, I think that's like such a beautiful community.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
What was that, Chuck? You were off mic there.
Oh, I said that's wonderful. Yeah, to have that relationship and that connection, and to for anything. But yeah, I don't find that it's necessarily there. The MFA thing, yeah, is kind of a strange environment for people. But the one thing I think it's worth sort of noting is that sometimes I've found that those relationships too, across genre, can occasionally sort of skew into weirder, more abusive situations too. So that's something for people to be aware of. I've seen writers sort of fall into things that are like mentorships.
Yeah,
they don't go that way necessarily.
Yep.
So
that was at Clarion, one of the things, because Clarion's another good example of this kind of very explicit mentorship thing. And no one teaches Clarion because they're making a lot of money for it. I think I'm on the Clarion board, and I think we're still paying $1,500 for a week that includes 5 weeks of preparation and where you work like 90 hours during that week. This is not you could get as much money mechanical Turking probably. So, people do that because it's important. It's part of their life. And a lot of them at this point were mentored by Kate and Damon, by Kate Wilhelm and Damon Knight, who founded the workshop. But one of the things that happens at every Clarion is there is a lecture on how to know when you're in a toxic workshop. and it's a workshop where there's one person whose opinion matters more than everyone else, and everyone tries to suck up to them, and that's just a cult. It's not good. So we have a couple of good questions in our Q&A here. So this is a very thorny one from Paul. If you were to write a short story in the style of the other two panelist styles, what would be the subject?
I saw this question so hard. I saw this question. I'm still like trying to be like,
If I was going to write a short story in the form of Cory Doctorow, I would make it all about fashion. I would write a story that is someone getting a makeover. First of all, because that would be such a fun opportunity to use that like super quick, snappy, incredible voice that Cory brings, especially with Attack Surface. It has so much of that voice. And also because I have talked to this person about, like, every time that I give Cory a compliment, I'm like, oh, I really like your glasses. It's like, here's all the information about these glasses and how they work and what their function is, as well as why they look good on me. And it's always fascinating. And so I would just try and tap into that incredible little vertical of wisdom to write just like 7,000 words of someone getting dressed.
Holy smokes, that's awesome. How about you? What's your Chuck story? What's your Chuck story?
oh God.
Oh, my Chuck story? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you, this is like a very shallow answer, Chuck, and I'm sorry, but it's because I have a huge freaking bone to pick with you, because my house is being invaded by ants.
Oh, yeah.
I just moved to a house in the middle of nowhere, and there's like yard all around it, and every few days there is an inch-wide river of ants coming from nowhere, going to somewhere else, and I have to deal with it. So it would just be a bug story. It would be a bug story.
Do you know what kind of ants they are?
Demon ones.
Just demon ants.
They come directly from the pit.
That's the fun.
They're hell ants.
Maiden ants.
Well, now I would want to see a Sarah Gailey hell ant story. But I do think there's something in a body horror thing from Sarah. That would be pretty rad. That
Ant body horror.
Ant body horror. And then Cory, your books, like, she talks about that sort of snappy, and the way you sort of deep dive and stuff, and even just, with Attack Surface, all of your books are like just this close to being like humor and satire. They're just on the edge of it, and I want to see you over that. I want to see something that's just boldly, just hilariously to middle fingers up to all kinds of things. That would be
That's fun. So I struggle with this one. I guess, with Sarah, I just want to write Westerns because you rekindled my love of Westerns. I quite like the form. I once wrote what was his name? The guy who wrote The Great Brain. These Utah semi-fictionalized memoirs, John D. something. I want to say John D. McDonald, but that's obviously not him. John D. Fitzgerald, something like that. And they're all set in frontier Utah. And they're memoirs about his brother, who was like sort of a Ferris Bueller sociopath, very smart, but like, terrible. John D. Fitzgerald, someone says in the chat. Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. Oh, I wonder if that's Mary Elizabeth from Mysterious Galaxy, Late of Mysterious Galaxy. It is. Hi. Anyway, so I would love to write a Western. I would love to write a queer resistance library Western. I mean, that was my great regret reading your book, was like, oh shit, someone's already written a queer resistance library. I'm a recovering library worker, and I've spent my professional career in information politics working with librarians, because they're like, you get these coalitions together of people who work on different issues, right to repair and whatever. And it's like, all right, who's well organized? And it's the librarians, right? They're gonna chair the meeting and have the minutes and send out everything. And I stand libraries in such a hard way. And so I would, that the resistance library is on the Western, I would love to be able to do. And Chuck, you're right that you're like, that your techno thriller, the thing that makes your techno thrillers, Chuck Wendig techno thrillers, is the horror elements. And there's that, Strauss has done that very explicitly with his Lovecraftian detective novels, or whatever you will call them, the laundry novels. Yeah. And I dote on that kind of horror stuff. I'm a horror baby. I get really easily scared and scare myself when I try to write it. My wife is a J horror and K horror nut. And we've had to stop watching it together because I will grab her hand really tightly. And then when it gets really scared, I will stuff my fist, which is now her fist, into my mouth and bite it. So I think I would try to scare my pants off in that Wendigian way.
I like it.
There's another question here. Do we write science fiction to show the positive path forward or to warn of the possible dystopia? That's the old, I'm here to tell you my professional capacity that cyberpunk was a warning, not a suggestion question. Where do you guys stand on the warning versus inspiration versus what have you?
It's neither for me. I don't really set out. I mean, it's weird. I don't necessarily set out to write any books with an agenda. Not an agenda to convince people of anything or to give the most spooky warning, or to be like, it's going to be great and here's how we fix everything. I just, I am a hyper selfish storyteller that I really just sort of want to tell the things that are freaking me out or that they're bugging me or that there are things that it's a pebble been bouncing around my head for a really long time. And I have to sort of shake it and get the pebble out. And that's the book. And I don't, whatever it ends up being, I found out very early on that when I tried to write books that were serving a purpose, they were trying to serve a market. They were trying to ape somebody's voice. They were trying to have a particular angle or agenda. I failed every time and they didn't feel like books I was writing. And then when I threw that all away and I was like, well, screw it. I'm just going to go bottom of the barrel and write the craziest, weirdest, me book I can write. And that was the book that got sold and ended up being on shelves. So I went in that direction very hard.
How about you, Sarah? Minatory, inspirational, many Tekel?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have two answers to this. The first one is that every threat is a promise and every promise is a warning, right? Like, depending on where you're standing.
That's parenting advice.
I'm glad that it comes across that way, because the other answer I was going to give is, like writing an SFF book, it's like talking to a teenager. If you say, hey, you better not do this thing, it'll turn out this way. Or if you say, hey, if you do this thing, I promise you it'll turn out great. They're going to probably go, this conversation is terrible, and I don't think that you understand my interiority in my life well enough to tell me that. Whereas if you just say, all right, well, here's the information. Here's as much room as I can give you and as much care I can take of you. Please do your best. To be your best, they'll do the thing that they think is going to be best. And sometimes it'll come out terrible and sometimes it'll come out great. But I think that's how I usually write, is instead of trying to say like, hey, watch it, or saying like, if we just do every step in this book that I say we should do, things will come out okay. Instead, I'm like, all right, be a person, best you can, even when everything's terrible. And also, like Chuck, I mean, my books are just anxiety dumpsters. I take a manuscript and I'm like, where's every bad feeling I have, and I just put it on in there. So I think that if I tried to make my books a warning or a promise or a threat, it would reveal way too much about me.
So Mary Elizabeth raises the very, very excellent point that you should talk about the Echo Wife right now.
Mary Elizabeth, you are a treasure, and I adore you. I have started doing a good author thing of keeping copies of my book near me when I'm doing events. And I love that I said that and then just realized that my copy of The Echo Wife is on the ground. Okay, so The Echo Wife is my book that comes out in February of next year, which we will all live to see. Oh, here, Chuck, I'll just hand this right through the... Did you get it? Okay. It is a science fiction book, the story of Evelyn Caldwell, a brilliant scientist who has invented adult duplicative technology, which means that I have one Cory Doctorow, and then I go boop, and I've got another one in a big test tube full of goop we can use for, whatever more book events. And it's the story of Evelyn Caldwell's divorce. It's a very close-in emotional story about the year after she divorces her husband, Nathan, who is having an affair with a clone of her who he created by stealing her technology so he could have a less threatening version of her. It is definitely an example of what happens when I take all my bad feelings and put them into a manuscript.
That's great. So I'm probably a lot more explicit about warnings and inspirations than you guys will cop to anyway. I have worried about the end of the world since very early on. I was brought up in the anti-nuclear proliferation movement. I spent a lot of time really expecting that maybe me and everyone will be dead in the 80s. And, got arrested with my dad blockading a nuclear refinery that was building, refining uranium for American arms and so on. So, it's really like central to kind of my origin story is that eschatology, that fear of the end of the world. And I really doted on and loved the cozy apocalypse, right? I loved the Day of the Triffids and all of those other stories, Neville Shute, that looking back on them now, I feel not so good about. I feel like they're all the stuff that Joe Walton has written about them, where they're just basically about middle-class people having a quite a nice life because the pearls know their place again, and the ones that don't get eaten by giant plants, it's a pretty toxic way of thinking about the end of the world. And with Walkaway, I really leaned hard into the ideas that Rebecca Solnit brought up in her book, Paradise Built in Hell, this idea that disasters are when people rise to the occasion, and that the stories we have about, the innate barbarism that emerges during crisis is really just a reflection of what sociologists call elite panic, right? The conviction on the part of plutes that, because if the situation were reversed, they would come and eat us, that we're just slavering to eat them, and notwithstanding a lot of eat the rich jokes. And so, I really have been explicitly trying to find in my stories ways to talk about disasters where people rise to the occasion as still being full of drama. And the drama that I've hit on is that it's drama in which people who are of goodwill and good faith have fundamental, irreconcilable differences of opinion about what to do about a crisis. And that creates this really intense struggle. It's far more intense. In fact, I think it's some of the bitterest fights we have, within science fiction, say all the culture war stuff, where you have people who you quite like and who've been really important to who you are and whose books have meant a lot to you and who've been kind to you personally, and they say something just ghastly. And that they're not saying it to be cruel, but you can't figure out how to frame up, I don't know, J.K. Rowling's remarks with what she's meant to you, and that I think is it's a very powerful way to write about conflict, especially during disasters. So right now I'm writing a new novel. It's a post-apocalyptic, or not post-apocalyptic, an environmental catastrophe novel called The Lost Cause, that's set after the Green New Deal. And it's in a world in which we have all of the environmental catastrophes that you would imagine in the most apocalyptic novel. And the thing that makes it not an apocalyptic novel or a dystopia is that they've confronted it, right? They said, oh yeah, for the next 300 years, our species has got to move all of our cities 20 kilometers inland. That's our project, right? We have to, our new normal is that there will be hundreds of millions of displaced people who are traumatized, and we have to figure out what to do about it. So rather than being helpless and terrified, they call themselves the first generation in a century that doesn't fear the future. And for me, that is the most chewy kind of disaster. It's a disaster that's not a dystopia. It's a disaster where things go wrong and people fix them, not instead of a disaster where things go wrong and we're revealed to have been kind of fallen from grace, right? That's the message of The Road, is that whatever our ancestors did to build civilization is a lost art, like building Egyptian pyramids or something. And that if we lose this civilization, we could never build another one. When the machine stops, it's exploding in white hot shrapnel, not coasting to a graceful stop that we can then push start again,
I find that such an interesting perspective because it's one that inherently prioritizes the preservation of the status quo. That says this civilization, we have to protect it at all costs, because if it collapses, which is, the thing that people invoke when they see lots of protests. They're like, oh no, civilization is going to collapse. And it's okay, there's still a lot of people, and people are social, and we inherently build societies with each other. The idea of that collapse being permanent feels to me an awful lot like something that something that someone invented in order to keep people from doing things that might damage society the way it's currently structured.
Yeah.
I always thought it's weird to sort of go into the religion a little bit. I remember taking a class in college. It was taught by this Southern Baptist minister. His name E. Lee Stoffel. We always talk about E. Lee Stoffeles, which surprisingly he was okay with. He was actually much cooler than I expected him to be. And he often went on and on about the idea of apocalypse. And obviously he was a smart academic guy despite being a Baptist minister, and he was clear that the Bible was not attempting to tell you about an actual apocalypse, but rather grapple with political realities and send coded messages. But I always found it fascinating that apocalypse was this idea of revelation. And in the truest sense, it was a revealing, not like in the grim, like revelation and we're all going to die and Jesus is going to come and spank us or whatever's going to happen. But the idea that it was a change, it was like a cycle ending and a cycle starting, that idea of not simply stopping, like just like that's it for us and we're done, but it's like an evolution and a change, and to sort of grapple with those changes and to be sort of in that as those gears are turning from one to the other. Cory, you're sort of talking about telling stories in that turn of the gear, like you're sort of telling a story in that changeover, in that position of grappling is the most fascinating. Like you said, chewy is a pretty great adjective for what that is, because there's a lot there. I mean, there's just so much there, and it's not so simple in black and white as like, well, this ends and it sucks and it's a disaster and there's a tidal wave and we're all going to die. But like the tidal wave came, and now what? And the now what is that turning of the gear that's the fascinating part of the story.
Yeah. Kim Stanley. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, there's this book that I love. The name of the author's escaping me right now, but it's called Reversed Thunder, and it's a book all about how to read the book of Revelations in the New Testament. And it's a wonderful interpretation that says that everything described in Revelations is intended to be a shock to the reader. As you're reading it, it's supposed to be like just this splash to your brain of like, whoa, this is all crazy, to make you wake up to the Word of God in that context. And I love the idea of apocalypse as revelation in that sense. Apocalypse as the wake-up call that brings in the generation that doesn't fear the future. As Cory was saying, just the idea of what we think of as apocalypse and a civilization and a world ending now being not the ending of everything, but the ending of the world where we weren't paying attention and doing things to try and protect each other and care for each other.
Yeah, Stan Robinson's last novel, he says, has just come out. He says he's not writing novels anymore, the Ministry of the Future. He's writing about the Sierras from now on. I've been not reading it because for the same reason I didn't read The Shepherd's Crown when it came out, because like the idea of there not being more Stan Robinson novels to read is really sad. But he just did an interview with Elliot Pieper about this, and he talked about the structure of feelings, where feelings, like there are analogs to our feelings in between us, right? What sadness is and what happiness is, and between other animals. Our cats get sad and angry and whatever. And what's different is how we structure the feelings, what meaning we ascribe to them, and how those meanings change over time. And that we are in a moment in which we don't know what our feelings mean. That like the yearning for the return to the normal is not, I mean, there is no normal we're going back to, obviously. And, it reminds me of Joe Walton's essay on cozy apocalypses and how Neville Shute was really upset on behalf of his mother, who now had to contend with uppity poor people when she went shopping, and how it really distressed her. And he spent a lot of time trying to calm his upper class mother, hoping for a return to the pre-war days before there was shared prosperity and a social network. And we are restructuring our feelings, and we do it with stories. So, to the extent that what we do is more than helping people pass the endless grind between the cradle and the grave, like that's a thing we're doing. It's somewhat awesome.
Well, that's sort of what going back to earlier is I write books to try to figure out what I feel.
Yeah, me too.
I don't always know where I'm at, and I can't just let it be anxiety in my head. I got to be like, well, this has to be something. So let's, spill the demons out into the circle, and let's answer, fight, or what happens next.
So I'm going to give you both a chance to say anything that you haven't said, because we're at the time.
Confession.
And then I'm going to say thank you.
I already name dropped the Echo Wife, so like, thanks, Mary Elizabeth. I don't have to do that again. I will say, if you're attending this event, you're probably already interested in reading Attack Surface. If you're like, oh, I'm attending this event, what's Attack Surface? It is so good. It's beautiful. It's one of those books where like my shoulders kept doing this while I was reading it. It's also very funny. It is like light about heavy things in a way that makes reading them not feel like a punch to the gut, which is like a novelty right now. So read it. The audiobook is gorgeous. Don't leave this event and be like, oh, maybe I'll pick that up someday. Just do it. You want it.
They had to buy a copy to attend. So we're
okay, then never mind. I don't need to plug it to you guys. Do whatever you want with your lives. I'm not your boss.
Chuck, how about you?
I was going to ask if I could have Echo Wife, but Caro in the comments has already said I'm getting it. So I have nothing. Yeah. I have nothing to add. I'm good here.
Well, I have a thing to add, which is to say thank you very much to Fountain, and thank you, Sarah and Chuck. It was really such a treat doing these events and getting to spend an hour every night with people I really admire who say smart things and then sometimes say nice things about my books too. Is so nice. I did want to mention that there's 4 more of these nights. And if you go to attacksurface.com, which a very kindly reader just, after the book came out said, hey, I really like your books. I registered attacksurface.com 15 years ago. I never knew what to do with it. Do you want the domain? So if you go to attacksurface.com, you can see the rest of the tour. The thing about the tour is that every event requires that you buy a book, and you clearly do not need more than one copy of this book, even if it's very good. So I have a solution. I'm pasting a URL into the chat there. That is a list of libraries, schools, prisons, halfway houses, and other institutions that would like copies of the book. And if you want to attend another night, you can put their address in instead of yours, and they'll get your copy, your extra copy of the book. There's also a form link there that if you're working with one of those institutions, you can add it to the list. Thank you everyone for coming, especially those of you who've been to more than one of these. That's amazing, above and beyond. And thank you very much to Fountain. I mean, you folks were so kind to me the last time I was there, and this has been wonderful. Thank you.
I didn't want to let you guys get out of here without saying thank you from us. So deeply, this has been an amazing week. We've had history, we've had skincare, we've had wonderful SFF tonight. And you know what? Weirdly, they've all had similar messages. It's skincare was all about, don't let the man sell you skincare products. You can make them in your house. You're buying a whole bunch of garbage from corporate whatever. So I learned a lot from that. I learned a lot from history, and I learned a lot tonight. But more than anything, this is the most I've smiled in a while. So I really, really appreciate that. It's tough these days, and wonderful audience. Oh my gosh, they're great. Yeah. Look at them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Wear a mask.
Wear a mask.
Yes.
Wear a mask, please. I want to leave my house.
Yes. Good night,
y'all. All right. Thanks, everyone. Stay strong.